Really excited to have Francis and Mason joining. This has been a really fun year for us as we have recognized the 45th anniversary of various literature conferences for the writing of the basic text. 1981 was a busy year for the Literature Committee, and this is the third uh, literature conference held in 1981. There's one more to go. We're excited about that in September. But we're gathered this morning because we want to talk about the Fifth World Lit Conference as we approach the 45th anniversary of that, the starting of that conference on June 29th, 1981. So, Francis Mason, thanks so much for joining. Will you mention real quickly the episode that will accompany this for the Living Clean podcast?
Yeah, so glad to be here, Chris. Thanks for having us. Yeah, we will be dropping an episode that starts off with Francis and I's breakdown, followed by some interviews of participants that were there, and that will come out on the anniversary.
Great.
I would also just like to add that Chris and I did a meeting on Zoom 5 years prior during the pandemic, and then I'll be dropping that episode on Thursday the same week. So Francis's archive will be pulling something out of the archive during the pandemic.
Well, I feel like these efforts are really putting together a great set of resources for anyone interested in the future for doing more research into the history of this really kind of remarkable process of creating a book for Narcotics Anonymous. So we're going to jump in and get started with where we left off. So the Fourth World Lit Conference was held in Santa Monica, California. It ended on May 1st, 1981, without a finished draft. And if you recall, going into that Lit Conference, it was Bo's hope that they would finalize the draft because they worked so hard in Memphis. They got the draft out for review. The Fourth World Lit Conference was going to be reviewing input and making whatever final changes. But it also involved a lot of folks from California showing up who had never been involved. And so a whole bunch of new voices coming in and input. And so while Bo was hoping that the book would be approved at this World Service Conference, which started on May 1st, the day that the Lit Conference was ending, they end the conference without a finished draft. Second big thing was that Santa Monica draft was either lost or stolen. We talked about that in the fourth World Lit Conference video and presentation and blog. Bo also, he resigned at that point as chair of the World Service Conference Literature Committee. He'd been in that role for 2 years. Roger became elected as the new chair of the World Service Conference Literature Committee at the 1981 World Service Conference. And then we also talked about how Jim M. from Ohio began planning the Fifth World Lit Conference, which was going to be held in Warren, June 29th to July 5th. And Jim, in a gesture of hospitality, invited Roger to come live with him and his family on the family farm, as Roger was new in this role as chair of the Literature Committee and preparing for this literature conference. We also saw that there was work that continued. And this is from looking at the minutes of the Fifth World Lit Conference, the Chapter 4, How It Works. This was sent to an unspecified city in California where local members completed the introduction to the chapter along with steps 1 and 2. We saw that Chapter 6, the 12 Traditions of Narcotics Anonymous, was sent to Southern California where work on the first 5 traditions was completed. Chapter 8, We Do Recover, was entrusted to members in British Columbia, Canada. Chapter 9, Just for Today, Living the Program. St. Louis members completed 2 pages on this chapter. Chapter 10, More Will Be Revealed. A rough outline was drafted by members in Lincoln, Nebraska. So the folks that are kind of involved with the host committee, Jim M., who we've introduced in previous presentations, his story, I Felt Hopeless, was in the third through the fifth editions of the basic text. He passed away in 2017, a month shy of 38 years of recovery. Two other folks, Roy D. Was a co-chair of the host committee. His story, Why Me, Why Not Me, was in the first through the fifth editions of the basic text. He passed away in March of 2005. And then Pam K., co-chair of the Fifth World Lit Host Committee. Don't have much information about her clean date and some of those other details. Planning the Fifth World Lit Conference, Jim M. secured Willard Hall, which was a renovated elementary school that came with classrooms, an auditorium, cafeteria, and 100 cots upstairs. And this, for the first time, created a place where the literature conference was providing lodging at the same time for those attending. And this is a picture that Francis tracked down of Willard Hall. Francis, you want to add any additional context about Willard Hall and what you've learned about it?
Well, it was named for a woman named Frances Willard who was involved with the temperance movement. So it was called Frances Willard School. And so I thought it was kind of meaningful that it was named for a person, like that was working at like creating abstinence from substances like early on. The building was torn down in the 2000s, and then there's a school in its place again called Frances Willard. So that's what I found out.
Okay, thanks. Mason, jump in at any time if you've got stuff to add. This is the flyer and registration form for this World Lit Conference. The theme of it is that others may find the freedom of recovery we have found. And then on the registration form, please arrange housing for me at no charge. Please have someone meet me at bus, plane, date of arrival. Points out the nearest airports, Youngstown, Ohio, Cleveland, Ohio, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And again, accommodations are being provided at no charge. He had 115 people appear in the minutes, coming from 18 different states. But the two things that I think are most important from my perspective is that you had Australia joining by phone, and then Vancouver, British Columbia participated by Air Express and also a $35 donation. There was continued California involvement, as we talked about in the last presentation. The Fourth World Lit Conference was really the California Fellowship's introduction to the Literature Committee. So prior to Santa Monica, World Lit Conference 1, 2, and 3, only 4 members from California had attended a World Lit Conference. So at Santa Monica, a ton of people from California attended. Now you got people who were introduced to this project and process in California who continued on to Warren, Ohio. And you had 7 people show up now, the most representation at a literature conference outside of California by Californians. Of these 6, or of these 7 that attended, 6 first became involved in Santa Monica. Dean G was the only one to have prior World Lit Conference involvement prior to Santa Monica. Mason.
Yeah, I think it's important to add, the fourth World Literature Conference gets, the highlight of it is we talk about the draft being lost or whatever. But I think this right here speaks to, even though some things happened that didn't go according to plan, I think the atmosphere and the whole movement in general was so powerful that when these folks from California finally engaged, they're so inspired that they're willing to come all the way to Warren, Ohio, after getting a taste of the conferences.
As we were talking before we started recording, for both of us, and I think Francis too, some of our favorite kind of histories that we've heard have to do with Californian members developing a greater appreciation for what they have after being exposed to people from communities that were not as rich in NA meetings and experience. Francis.
Yeah, I was thinking about the influx of so many people coming into the conference probably created a situation for them like, what are we going to do with all these people and how do we put them to work? Because they were so used to smaller working groups and they had to shift to larger working groups. But, like it was a small price to pay, like to get a buy-in from the other, like people coming from California, Sally and Nikki, like there were people that really it changed them, but like I think there was a price to pay, like with the so many people showing up that it like their little tight knit group had to function differently in the moment at 4. So I was just kind of like, what are the like what is the cost of having so many people show up at one time and then having to pivot in the moment? You got a buy-in from some of the locals. And also, it kind of speaks to the resiliency of the literature movement and how they could pivot in the moment and like regroup in 5. Like 5 was a pivotal moment where they had to overcome a lot of obstacles. Thanks.
Yeah, I thought about that before. Time passes between each literature conference. You've got some people attending the previous ones, but you're constantly having to introduce people to a framework and a kind of a philosophical orientation to how this writing was going to occur. Like you're having to onboard people to this is how we do it on top of an already established process of careful kind of consensus-based review in a very structured way. We're doing this in a small working group. We're taking this to the larger group conscience. We're giving input and sending it back and making revisions. Like that's one of the things that makes the basic text such a unusual piece of literature is how intentional the inclusion of others was in the process, when at times it would seem easier just to say, let's just have a couple people write this or one person author this. It would be much more efficient in terms of expediency. Francis.
If you're involved with like activities, like, and you do all this planning for your convention and then things go awry, like in the moment you have to fix it. I was also thinking about the election of Roger into that position. Like it was planned, like there was some planning done, but it wasn't what was planned, because I think that they were looking at Jim Miller being the next chairperson for the literature committee, and he didn't get it. And I thought it was incredibly sporting of Jim to invite Roger to stay at his house, like because he had to have been super disappointed that he didn't get that position. Like in the committee, the movement itself wanted Jim as well, and so that was like another thing that they had to overcome and work with. Like a person that they may or may not have wanted, like they got somebody else. So that was kind of one of the other developments I was thinking about.
Yeah, excellent point about principles for personalities and application of the program by Jim. We talk about this a little bit more in the blog, but some of Bob Stone's observations about Roger being an unusual choice for this position, having really just kind of gotten introduced to the NA fellowship, though he'd been in AA, but only really introduced to the NA fellowship in Memphis in end of January of 1981, and not having really any strong roots in a NA home group or a community of NA members. So again, kind of an unusual choice at that time. So to kind of continue with this thing about the continued California involvement, what was also, I think, important about this was not just that there were Californians who went to Warren, but who went. So you had Chuck S., Board of Trustees, and he was both like Board of Trustees version 1960s and Board of Trustees version after the NA tree, Sally E., Sydney R., who would become a future member of the Board of Trustees in 1983, and also Greg P., member of the Board of Trustees. Now, he's living in Oregon at this point, but his recovery started in North Hollywood. So let's talk for a minute and divert for a minute about what happened during the conference, the break that some members took to go to Cleveland.
Well, one of the things I was thinking about is like how the service structure has been like developing and the momentum in the growth of Narcotics Anonymous, not only around people rallying to these world literature conferences and doing service, but it helps the formation of the regions that they're in. And so we know that's something that happened in Memphis. Like the Mid-South Regional Service Conference is happening after the Third World Literature Conference. And then as an outgrowth, like the Volunteer Regional Convention and Regional Committee form after the Mid-South Regional Service Conferences. We did an interview with Charles Kay, and we asked him the question, well, what did you do after the conference? Did you drop out? He's like, well, I got busy forming the Florida region. And so these are the things that we keep hearing about in this process. So I'm not surprised a bit that they took a break to go to Cleveland to form the Ohio region during the conference. And it's exciting to me to hear about. It should also be noted there's an incredible amount of growth that was happening as a result of the world conventions occurring in these neighborhoods, and us following the momentum of the world conventions with the conferences. So yeah, that's it. Mason?
Yeah, I think something to note too is that Greg and Chuck are helping with this process too. That they are, coming from California and then going to Cleveland to help them organize this. And I don't know if the Ohio region was necessarily the goal, but after the debate and some of the issues they had was talked about, then it was decided to form the region. And yeah, just an interesting little nugget to see all the work around the conferences. I think the conferences, and rightfully so, get a lot of attention, but this work in between conferences, man, is amazing too. Like this was a really broad effort throughout the country and the world of developing not only our book but just the fellowship in general.
I think if we talk about it from kind of current, more recent NA service, the idea of fellowship development, that when events are planned or people with experience go to emerging communities, whether it's, as you talked about, Francis, there's a convention or a literature conference, that those things fertilize the soil, they inspire people, but they also pass along that hard-won experience that's described, that people have come about with. So yeah, so in the midst of the Fifth World Lit Conference, Chuck, Greg, a few others go up to Cleveland. Greg presides over the the meeting that results in the formation of the Ohio region. So Nikki was one of those Californians who continued to Ohio. We featured her in the last presentation of Santa Monica. And much like her experience in Santa Monica, meeting addicts outside of California would have a profound impact on her. So we're going to listen to Nikki talk about this.
What was really cool was while we were in Ohio, we got a call from Cincinnati because they had a meeting there, a guy named Chuck and his wife. And so we drove, they called because they were starting a meeting and they weren't sure what to do, and they had no literature. And Jimmy Kay had told them, well, call these people and maybe they can help you. Because we had a box of books that we were handing out to newcomers. We drove over there And we brought the literature, and we brought a working guide and talked to them about their meeting and had their first real NA meeting. What had happened is a priest had given them a white book, and on the back of the white book it had Jimmy's phone number. And so that's how they were able to call him, and that's how we got in touch with them. And so we basically took a meeting to them. Well, what happened was that meeting ended up following us to Warren, Ohio, and all these newcomers started helping with the book too. So they got to do some input. This is pretty cool. The best part of the story for me was standing on the balcony of this young couple's apartment before the meeting, and it still brings tears to my eyes. He's standing there. They had 6 months clean, but they'd been hanging on to the recovery with that white book that they had and that priest. Chuck asked me, how long have you been clean? And I said, 5 years. And he burst into tears. And I thought, I didn't mean to hurt his feelings, you know. He said, I didn't know an addict could stay clean that. That was the best part to me. The hope. Because like I said, I was kind of spoiled. I already had the hope. And I didn't know that other people didn't.
So just such powerful lessons for all of us in many areas of our lives when we kind of use just the circle that we live in to generalize that to everyone else. And then the kind of powerful experience when that's shattered. And you kind of realize, like, this guy has had no exposure to people in recovery. So the idea of an addict staying clean for 5 years, which I take for granted, is unthinkable to him, you know. And that shift that can occur within people is, I think, where some of those miracles and most important things can happen. So we're really grateful. Nikki passed away in 2025. We're just really grateful to have captured that. Thanks to Francis for setting that up back in 2021. Jim M., who we've talked about in previous presentations, if you may remember, selling plasma to get money to buy stamps to send out invitations to the second World Lit Conference. We're going to listen to him talk about how his wife Linda and 7 other members got from Lincoln, Nebraska to Warren, Ohio.
I sold him the bike for $1,500 if my memory serves me correctly, and it was Donna's bike in my mind, so she took the $1,500 and took a couple of vans full of people to the conference in Ohio.
As Boyd would indicate, this is an unfunded project, so there's not money coming from the service structure. Members are figuring out ways to raise money to be able to participate and get involved. And from my brief visits and exposures to members from the Kansas and Nebraska Fellowship, the men I met out there really value their motorcycles. So the idea of selling one seems like a pretty significant sacrifice to contribute to a book. June 29th, 1981, day 1. So this is from the minutes, the conference goals. The first 5 chapters of the book were lost. The first priority was to get the first 5 chapters typed and the second 5 typed up in the form that they were. And that's just kind of directly from kind of the minutes. It says the other 5 have been through input and partial second edit. Our first priority is to get the first 5 chapters retyped. What we also see in day 1 of the minutes is a focus on securing files. So after the previous experience in Santa Monica, I have to imagine that was a little bit disorienting because it had been such a trusting kind of culture, such an inclusive culture, and to have stuff either get lost or stolen had to create a sense of distrust and uneasiness to some level. And at least in the minutes, you see that they're very intentional now. There's a plan established for securing the files. They're stored in a separate room and someone's with them at all times. Files could be signed out and signed in, much like a library. Another goal that's identified in day one of the minutes is to update the mailing list. And so a large mailing list is being typed and gone over. If you have an address book, we would like to have the addresses that we don't have. We would also like phone numbers and last names if you have them. And that this mailing list would be used strictly in the fellowship, and that the World Service Office would receive a copy so they can compile the world directly. Reason being is the lit committee wants to get a hold of as many people in as many different areas as possible. It was also decided in day one, in the morning meeting, that work should occur on new pamphlets. And this, I think, speaks to a thirst for developing new literature. And I also think it speaks to creating a separate kind of culture away from and apart from Alcoholics Anonymous, which had been kind of foundational for many members in communities that just didn't have enough NA meetings, but also didn't have the literature that helps create that culture and so forth. Helps identify and define the program in Narcotics Anonymous terms. So they've got workshops in session, hospitals and institutions, 4-step, teenage addict, and sponsorship. There's an individual named Bill Z from Maryland. He went to the second East Coast Convention in Trenton at Trenton State University. He met Hank F. from Atlanta in person for the first time. He'd corresponded with him over the phone. And Hank asked him if he wanted to go to Warren, that as the East Coast Convention was ending, that Hank was heading that way. And so that was Bill's introduction to the World Lit Conference and the writing of the basic text. Just wanted to pause for a minute on this. Francis and Mason, if you have any input about the East Coast Convention, we haven't featured it as much, but it's been kind of a spot where people have been kind of recruited or introduced to this literature committee effort.
Yeah, I think the East Coast Convention probably deserves its own sort of spotlight at some time. Maybe a podcast or a blog around that, because it is very significant meeting ground, as so many of these relationships and ties to the literature conference, where people are being kind of called to the literature conferences from the East Coast Convention. It plays a significant part in this whole movement. And it's a it's a large gathering on the East Coast. It's one of the first major events on this side of the country. So, yeah.
I'll note that the Philadelphia Book Project just released, I think in early June here in 2026, the book Paving the Road as We Go, A Journey of Recovery in Philadelphia and Surrounding Areas, covering 1969 to 1982. And the last chapter in the book really focuses on the origins of the East Coast Convention. So that's been a great contribution to document and in writing some of that history for folks. Francis.
I don't know that I have much more to add. I've been seeing, I think that as we're recording, the East Coast Convention is happening. And so I see all my friends, history people, posting pictures of what's happening currently with the East Coast Convention. There's the contribution it has given, and then creating a rallying point for the literature movement. Bo going there early on. Hey, George, meet me at this convention. Him doing workshops to get people interested in, to carry the message about the literature movement. All of that should be emphasized in an episode or a blog post. But also, there's something that happens there every year. They're a fundraiser for basic text. What is to get into institutions, the profits from the East Coast Convention buys basic text. So the significance of that being a rallying point for people getting involved with the writing of the basic text, but it's also a place that generates basic text for members that are in institutions. So there's an ongoing legacy with that convention, which I think is kind of cool.
It's very cool. So that's how Bill gets, he goes to the East Coast Convention. He thinks he's coming back to Maryland after it's over, but he ends up in Warren. And so what we see in the second day of the morning meeting minutes is Bill, who lived with a form of muscular dystrophy, said he'd like to see a pamphlet for addicts with disabilities. And so this is kind of at the bottom here of the minutes. And while nothing comes from it at this point, we do end up seeing an IP on this. By that second day in the evening, though, it was decided that work needed to cease on pamphlets so that work on the main priority could occur, the book. So in some ways, there's this enthusiasm and creativity that's going on about what else can we do? How else can we carry a message through new literature? But then also recognition that we need to prioritize, like what's the primary purpose of this conference? We need to get this book done. And then day 3 kind of begins with similar sentiments. Charles says in his personal comments on the need for each of us to work on our book now. Let's get it together. Our brothers and sisters are dying. Group conscious resumed at 12:13 p.m. where Jim M. read chapter 1, which received a standing ovation, and then discussion was then held on revisions to the draft. So we're showing an excerpt from the minutes that kind of gives an overview of what that process was like. So out loud reading of the chapter, and then discussion that's occurred in the group conscience about what changes may need to be made. And so there's a number of things in here. Proposals for changes, delete sentence, an addict who uses alcohol and marijuana is in as much danger as a narcotics addict. The addict who uses marijuana and alcohol is in danger. As written, any mood altering or mind changing, including marijuana or alcohol drugs, ceased. Proposal closed, acceptable only in a clear majority. 5th proposal acceptable. And then we see page 1, paragraph 2, change sentence 2 and 3. The proposal is addiction is a disease which involves more than simple drug use. So this is just a snapshot to show, again, this is not single authorship. This is a snapshot into something that many people have said that they didn't believe that books could be written by committee. Mason.
Yeah, just a couple of comments. First, on day 2, I think this is a fun little nugget, is that they actually celebrate an addict named Donna who's celebrating 6 years with a watermelon feed. So I thought that was a interesting little nugget from day 2. And day 3, much like you were saying, I think what we're seeing here in real time with this slide is we are deciding what NA is going to be, what our identity is going to be. Like we're watching our identity being built before our eyes. Like how do we feel about the disease? What is the disease? And what makes what makes up participation is, and how do we view these certain types of drugs? And I think, we eventually get to where we are today. And, there's a lot of discussion in our fellowship today about, what is clean and all that. But you see that work right here, the origins of it. I just think it's really interesting.
Thanks, Mason. July 2nd, 4th day morning meeting, chapter 4, how it works, which is the 12 steps. This is the chapter that is kind of, I don't say most challenging, but requiring the most attention to maybe get right. And so it was decided that the workshop was too large and inefficient, and Teresa from Pennsylvania made a motion to break into individual workshops on each step, excluding steps 1, 4, and 5. And Greg at this point kind of steps in And I look at this as being an experienced member who's been involved since the early 70s and been part of literature creation and discussions about creating literature. He's reminding the group as they're working on this of a 3-point outline for each step. So one, are we including information in there on why we work this step? Are we including information on how we work this step? And are we including information on what are the results of working this step? And then they break into these groups. So they have these smaller chapter 4 workshops for steps 2, 3, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. And you can see some of the people that are involved there. Pete, who we've been on the Living Clean podcast before, Sally from the Board of Trustees, Charles Kay, and so forth. So this is stepping back to the minutes from the 1981 World Service Conference. Roger T. read input that had been submitted to the World Service Conference Literature Committee. And one piece of input said that more participation with the greater NA feel that at least one conference should be held in Canada for international world input. The book is not ready for hardback, but the World Lit Committee has helped spread more unity and more active service than any other phenomenon in the history of NA. So bringing this in because it starts speaking to how is international input being solicited. And as part of the report at the World Service Conference, it appears that Roger had taken this input to heart and during his regional report shared folks that he has reached out to and spoken to from an international perspective. So he's spoken with people in Germany, England, Scotland, Ireland's got 2 active groups, and then talked with a member in Australia. I report 3 or 4 meetings in Melbourne, reported a group in Spain and Guam. So you can see this effort, this international effort, or effort to include international input. And then what we see on day 4, the morning meeting, that Australia had submitted input on step 11, but it too had been lost. So on day 4, Mary Kay called Australia to type their input. Roger noted that Australia had sent input for step 11, but it was lost. Mary Kay called them this afternoon while it was tomorrow morning there for yesterday's input. She typed this input and Roger read it to the group. Any input or comments or observations about the technology available for including input from people who are not there?
Well, I beckon back to the photographs of Molly and Bo with the phone, and it sounds like this process is being repeated, and it's not the only time that it's happened where we're on the phone transcribing long distance of this. I can only imagine the phone bill from this one. We talked about how people got their phones shut off. What is the price tag for calling to Australia for input, and how long was this phone call, and how many, how long did it take for them to pay this bill off? But there was a lot of sacrifices made, and I really appreciate that. You were talking about the Lincoln and the motorcycles. I imagine they would much rather give away their blood than their motorcycles.
Yeah, you're right. July 3rd, which is day 5, they plan a banquet. It was suggested that members contribute $5 to the dinner. You have Jamie S. from Pennsylvania and Lisa B. from Virginia, who are the cooks. They had fruit punch, tossed salad, fruit cocktail, roast beef au jus, baked turkey, mashed potatoes and cream gravy, green beans, chocolate layer cake, vanilla ice cream, iced tea, coffee, and again, shows your cooks and setup and service. So this is something we've included in previous sections on the Fifth World Lit Conference. It's Sally E. later recalling the story that speaks to the inclusiveness. It's unclear if Jamie is who she's speaking of in this clip, but it's, again, kind of worth listening to about the culture and values of the Literature Committee and literature conferences.
there's a lot of things that happened with writing that book and a lot of miracles. And in Ohio, we were divvying up the workload, and there was a guy, and he raised his hand and he said, I can't read and I can't write, but I can cook. And if each of you will give me $3 a day, I'll fix you some good meals. And he did. That guy was so special. I mean, it was so special that he had the courage to do that. How many of us would have been able to do that? He only had a few months. He didn't have that much time. And by the way, Bob B tells me he's still clean today.
No restrictions based on skill, no restrictions based on a length of clean time, no restrictions based on experience, just a way for everyone to be involved. This is they had their own program for the banquet printed up, and it's in loving tribute to Bo, whose 2-year tenure as chairman of the World Service Conference Literature Committee has established consummate precedents, and without whose resolute dedication, studied concern, and untiring effort, the quote, work in progress could not have come so far so quickly. Thank you, Bo. We love you. You have master's ceremony, Bob G, who's pictured here with Jimmy K. Bob got clean in 77 at age 18. He passed in 2015 with 38 years of recovery and was a member of the World Board. Mason captured this. You want to speak to why this stood out to you?
Yeah, just interesting. Not a reading that we are familiar with. Came to believe. I actually had a correspondence with Pete while we were recording, and he says, I do not recall that being a standard reading used, perhaps just an extended reading on step 2. There was a lot of creative writing going on back then. With all the newsletters we had then, this might have been someone who wrote on step 2 that were asked to share at the banquet, my best guess. So interesting. And if you're listening to this, we would love your input if you're familiar, yeah, just thought it was interesting.
Great catch, great contacts, great job reaching out to Pete. Bill, who we introduced to you earlier, he got clean August 26, 1979. He attended his first NA meeting in June 18th, 1980, and he passed in 2021 with 42 years of recovery. So again, it does not anticipate that he's coming to this thing, doesn't even know about it, just shows up at the Second East Coast Convention, thinks he's riding back to Maryland afterwards, goes along with Hank and ends up writing the invocation. So in some ways, this speaks to, again, how easy it is to be invited to contribute and participate. So I'm going to show a screenshot of the invocation, and then it's typed out, and Francis is going to read through that just because this is a little bit blurry in some of the spots. But this was your will, not mine, be done.
Your will, not mine, be done. We of the committee humbly pray that we may, through the hand of faith, be gently guided to do your will. Too often, because we're human, we forget that we are your servants. You are not ours. At times, we bury ourselves so deeply inside our own egos that we lose sight of the real reason we're here. It is only by putting aside our earthly wants that we may find our godly needs. Glowing spiritually is the only light that will lead us down the path of true purpose. So we do his work. We must not fail to remember, your will, not mine, be done.
And then Chuck S. was introduced by Sally as the main speaker. He got clean May 15th, 1962. Again, mentioned he served kind of on both versions of the Board of Trustees, passed June 15th, 1994 with 32 years clean. Entertainment was organized and provided by Gina, who we've talked about. No Excuse for Loneliness and the Basic Text passed from AIDS, October 18th, 1986. Roger T. did the closing prayer. And then we just see some of the people that are involved. So not only the people we introduced, Jim, Pam, and Roy, but Donna from Nebraska is the secretary for the Fifth World Lit Conference. Mary Kay from Ohio is the treasurer. Linda B. and Bob M. are the recording secretaries, and the sound technician is Bob L. And then other roles, Linda is the librarian for the World Service Conference Literature Committee. You had the Board of Trustees, you had Bo, who's now vice chairman of the World Service Conference, and Joseph P., who's now treasurer of the World Service Conference. And as we talked about, the involvement of Australia, British Columbia, etc. This is input that Charles K. wrote about the banquet. It's a little bit hard to read that second line, but Mason's going to take a stab at reading this to us.
All right. So tonight marked a turning point in the history of NA and the World Literature Conference. All who were present were able to enjoy fellowship and humor. We have been blessed to have a few of our trusted servants share their message of hope, recovery, and service. Members with from 5 days to 20 years clean were present. The spirit of the higher power was present more than ever. The gentle flow of pure spiritual energy touched everyone who was present. This has to be the very best banquet in the history of the WLC.
Seventh day evening meeting, July 5th. By the end of the conference, the book had taken the following shape. Chapter 1, Who's an Addict, is closed. Chapter 2, What is the Narcotics Anonymous program, is closed, meaning that no more inputs being provided or accepted at this point. Chapter 3, Why Are We Here, closed. Chapter 4, How It Works, is the first chapter slated for group conscience at the Sixth World Literature Conference, which has been scheduled for Miami, Florida. Chapter 5, What Can I Do, needs more work, has been through cut and paste. Chapter 6 of 12 Traditions is going back to California for review by some members of the Board of Trustees. Chapter 7, Recovering Relapse, needs more work, has been through cut and paste. Chapter 8, We Do Recover, is closed. Chapter 9, Just for Today, Living the Program, needs more work, has also been through cut and paste. And Chapter 10, More Will Be Revealed, is waiting a second edit. At the morning meeting on day 6, Charles K. had made the motion that the Sixth World Lit Conference be held in Fort Lauderdale. So it's kind of Miami, Fort Lauderdale. And this is because it's being proposed that it be held there following the 11th World Convention of NA in Miami. Back in Santa Monica, they were talking about having a literature conference following the World Convention in Miami in September, but they ended up bringing the 5th one in before then. So there'd been some talk about this as a site, and it just happens that this will become the 6th World Lit Conference, and we'll listen to Charles recount this.
Me and Tom, we hitchhiked Santa Monica to Warren, Ohio for the LitCon. And I mean, amazingly, it was like one of those God things where you got rides that would take you full states or 2 states over, and you'd be on the road for maybe 10 minutes and somebody else would pick you up. Well, we hitchhiked there, stayed in Warren. Then we went from Warren, we were going to Miami. So we went through Philly, hitchhiking still, down the coast, stop offs in DC, Atlanta, and then, made it down to Miami. Nope, don't know anybody. I knew Bob. It's like, Bob, we're coming into town. All right, I got a place for you to stay. Hooked us up at somebody's house, and then I ended up staying. It was like nothing was planned. It's like, well, that's where the World Convention's going to be. And then the Lit Conference is after that. So we're going to be there.
So that kind of brings us to concluding thoughts. In many ways, things are getting close. and yet things are still far away from being done. Francis, Mason, any concluding thoughts that you had? I know one thing you mentioned was the number of man hours or person hours that were put into this conference.
Yeah, the minutes reflect. We couldn't tell if it was Roger that said this or not, but it was nearly 10,000 man hours of work will be completed by the end of this conference, which is just fascinating. Like just to think about all the effort. And another thought I have is what a rebound. Like after such a large letdown at Santa Monica, what a rebound. Like just, the perseverance, dusting yourself off, picking yourself back up as a conference and getting back to work. And a lot of work was completed, not just with the book. I mean, there's work on IPs, creating a region. I mean, man, awesome.
Yeah, I was thinking about this Philly book, Paving the Road as We Go. And, like this is what the literature conference was doing is they were, like having to make adjustments in the moment. And, like they, overcame a lot of obstacles and, like soldiered up and did what they needed to do to get back on track. I was also like looking at, so Bo goes on to become the vice chair of the World Service Conference, and Joseph goes on to become the treasurer. So we're seeing this leadership in the literature movement being shifted over to the World Service Conference, and so the literature movement has a bigger impact on than we think. And then also, like we're seeing the trustees being involved with the literature movement too. So it's like the movement is kind of going in two different directions. Like, is this a separate movement, or is this something that we're all of a sudden we're becoming unified around the first tradition? I was thinking about like these people in Narcotics Anonymous history that become pivotal in like a hero emerges in Greg that helps us write the service structure, and then we have Bo that helps us get our book done. But these are things that are happening like in the literature movement too. Is like we see Jim as a leader in Ohio, like somebody kind of like rises up in the leadership position, and the same thing with Charles, being like that leadership person, like that we needed for the six. And so, like that's a theme that I kind of seen like at a larger scale in Narcotics Anonymous history, like a champion emerging, but also like on a more smaller level, like within the literature movement, we keep seeing people come forward in leadership positions, and I think that's kind of cool too. So, thanks.
So there's a thirst for this. There's a kind of a contagion where people getting exposed to other folks who are being of service and committing themselves to this. It took somebody stepping forward and getting the ball rolling. But once the ball's rolling and people are introduced, you see there's a real thirst and desire for literature, information, growth, infrastructure, and that's also kind of a contagious thing when people get connected to it. So I'm so thankful for your time. I want to thank Boyd for his work, though he couldn't join us today, in helping to put this material together, both from just collecting it and organizing it and thinking through it. Really excited. This will be a great year of 2026 as we knock out another one, and then maybe we'll do one on the Mid-South Regional Service Conference in November. Would be great to do a presentation, but we're adding to the repository of information for future generations, and really thankful for your time and support with that. So thank you so much.